Everyone. This is an ordinary opening. Black has taken the corner and wants territory. White's approach is also standard. There are many choices: a diagonal move, a flying move, a small knight's move, or different pincers. But our question today is more specific. If Black must defend the lower right corner now, which corner enclosure should Black choose? This first question is difficult, so I will give you two correct answers. Two choices are correct, and two are wrong. Don't think 10 moves are too few to require thought. If you want to defend the corner, you must think. Let us look at it. Take a little time to answer. If you have not answered yet, make your choice now. This example teaches an important lesson. To follow a world champion's thinking, we need to work harder. Most class did not choose correctly, but nobody was tricked. This is the game record. Let us see what the position means. If Black must defend the corner, Black's main task is to prevent White's next move. In the upper right, White may well play a flying press. Without support, Black cannot push and cut. Normally Black flies or jumps out. In fact, jumping is even more likely. But this way of thinking leaves White two excellent points. One is this press, a key point that changes the balance between the two sides. The other is the splitting move above. If White presses and Black cannot answer, Black must tenuki and play the splitting move. Black cannot answer once more, then the whole position falls apart. Neither side in Beijing can live. Black cannot allow White both to press and to extend near the star point. So White plays the splitting move, and White can hang underneath. Black cannot stop that hang. Then Black's corner is not alive, so Black must add another move to defend the corner. What was the point of the high enclosure? The opponent can press repeatedly. Don't think attaching and then making a two-space high jump will solve the problem. White already has both the press and the side extension. Either choice is acceptable for white. The high jump has no value. If the side has not developed, white can invade the lower side freely. This solid-looking wall does nothing. Therefore, black must make a low corner enclosure. Strictly speaking, D is slightly better, but C is also accepted here. When white comes in, the repeated Han becomes tasteless. That is the strength of the world champion's choice. This was a recent game by a world champion playing black. As the game develops, many of you may recognize the player. Look at the whole plan. It is coherent. This is Go, and this is whole board logic. Black leaves white an invitation, come in. If white presses, the position is just right for black. Even if white hains, black may kick here rather than hain back. This is a perfect point. These moves are practical. Learn this habit of anticipating the opponent's best direction in advance. Why are world champions strong? They think more and their reasoning is more rigorous. So the answer is low, not high, corner defense. A high enclosure lets white invade the corner later. That is the answer. Now return to the game. White must fly. If white does not fly, black raises the head and gets both important moves. If black does not defend the corner and plays above, white may approach either side. There is no line where black defends and white avoids the flying press. A counterpincer is even less meaningful because this stone is already in its best place. White must play the flying press. It is the key point in the balance between the two sides. Now white reaches another fork. One move is only there to distract you. Do not learn it. Should white press, extend along the upper side at B or C, or expand from D? This question is harder because there is only one correct answer. I hope this game broadens your view. It contains several positions that are genuinely worth thinking about. They can be used directly in your own games. Do not worry about missing the answer. If you answered a question correctly, you would already be a world champion. These are extremely difficult positions, so take time to study them carefully. Take a moment to think. Let us see which choice you prefer. Give it a try. First, one move is definitely just a decoy. Which move is it? It is D. The focus is on the right and the top. You cannot lock this area down yet. The splitting move and the connection are not even settled, so what are you expanding? Extending from below has no effect. Remember this, when expanding across a large gap, connect along the side first. What is a large gap? A distance like this, already 10 lines wide. Pause and think about that. This move cannot be omitted. If you do not extend along the side, the opponent can split at will. If that can be captured, it only proves the opponent played badly. It does not justify omitting this move. Then why can white play at A? Because it changes the balance between the two sides. Playing A divides black's potential, so the left and right sides are not the same. On the left, black has no framework, so making a diagonal move there achieves nothing. Black cannot play on the left, pressing on the right is possible. The press is possible, but it misses the point of this question and plays directly into black's plan. Since white does not press, white should extend along the side. Why choose B instead of C? Often, there is no special technique. The key is anticipating what will happen. Black has also given white two choices here. Can you see them? Whichever point white chooses for the extension, black must attach. Black has no alternative. If black does not attach, the opening collapses and black falls far behind. This reply is compulsory. So, what does white, as a champion, think? If black will attach wherever white extends, white normally chooses B, not C. At C, this invasion cannot be handled. When extending along the side, take the center. The invasion cannot be captured, and attacking from this side does not work. But why is this move correct now? Let us look at the next diagram. After white extends, the situation resembles black's unsettled corner. Black must attach. If black invades now, white need not answer, white can press. Black no longer has a good splitting point. Black will split here and get out comfortably. Black could also extend on this side. After these exchanges, if black invades, white can tenuki and press repeatedly. Black has no good points left. Look carefully, this is too close to white's thickness, and black cannot tenuki or stop. Black must attach. White cannot accept black jumping out, because after the jump white must reinforce. This is the decisive point between the two sides. Once black jumps down and white has to add a move, white's position becomes unplayable. Look at white's framework, width, height, and real territory. White is behind everywhere. Black already has 3 corners. In outside influence, black's right side plus lower side is clearly larger than white's top. Pause, and assess the whole board. So wherever white extends, black must attach. Then white must hain. If black wants to hain, black cannot stop and will certainly extend, usually like this. White cannot hain at the head either. White is too short of liberties. After this connection, the shape is painful. The diagonal jump is also false because it does not repair white's weakness. Black turns here, and white has no effective defense. Locally, white cannot hold. If white avoids the diagonal jump, the connection and attachment shape is still poor. Black gets the head out and white cannot kill. Black can also separate white. If white defends below, black leaves. Later, black has severe forcing sequences and endgame follow-ups. White's shape tells the story. So the conclusion is this: wherever white extends, black attaches. White cannot let black jump, so white must hang to fight for the head. After that, black must extend. Black normally does not hang. Why is the champion strong? In the mind, all these necessary consequences have already been worked out. With this area already thick, why play here? Why not shift one line to the left? The right side cannot be invaded. If black shifts left one line, the invasion on the left disappears as well. The present move is playable, but later it remains uncomfortable because of these attachments and invasions on the left. Outside this special shape, one would certainly extend in the center. But once black has thought this through, black cannot stop. Why not play here instead? Now nobody would think the star point is better than the left side. The long explanation has a purpose. When white chose the side extension, the champion had already calculated all the consequences we just discussed. Without completing that reading in advance, white could not have extended here. In another situation, white could not extend here because black would invade. But this is special. Black must fight for the head because black has a framework below. Black sees that this invasion cannot work. Then this diagonal kick is an extremely practical move that you can use directly. Why is this diagonal kick useful? First, there is a bad cutting point here. After white cuts, black cannot Atari from the outside. Black can only Atari flat along the third line, or play a small diagonal move. That cut becomes a future fighting weakness. Second, if black later tries to make territory here, white can kick in sente and make the corner uncomfortable. White may even kick directly inside. Black cannot push back too hard. If black does, trouble starts. If black backs off, this corner becomes white's. So black kicks once to test white's reply. This move is uncomfortable for white. If white squeezes, black connects, and black has defended the corner without losing a move. Black then continues to attach because black has not played in the middle. This prevents the cut as much as possible and secures the corner. White cannot tenuki. If white descends instead, black's connection is sente. Black may even delay the connection, then the cutting point disappears. This is a small technique. But use it only when the invasion truly cannot work. It gives up reduction on this side and loses some thickness. If an invasion is still available, kicking here becomes awkward, not useful. Pause and think about this key point. Here, the invasion cannot work. Trying it would only be a gift to black. Can this group live in such a small space? The outside move threatens to kill it. Since the invasion cannot work, black uses this kick instead. To gain more territory, white hains on the second line, squeezing above is also possible. After the second line hain, black is satisfied to connect in cent. White cannot tenuki. If white does, black's repeated heine comes in, all in sente. Reversing the order is worth well over 10 points, nearly 20. It is too large. If white tenukis again, remember this tesuji, hane above first. If black cuts immediately, white can retreat and still has room to defend. We need not show e-branch. After black hanes at 12, white must capture at 13, otherwise black takes 3 stones. If white tanukis locally, black gains too many sente moves. Notice how clean this tesuji is. So white must reinforce. White knows not to defend on the 4th line because the top is already thick. Defending on the 2nd line secures more territory below. Now comes our 3rd question. After black resolves this weakness in sente, 3 choices are clear. Expand along the bottom, expand toward the center at B, the key point affecting both sides, or enclose territory directly near C pause and choose one. Take a moment to think. This choice is important. After you choose, we will examine the principle behind it. Sometimes choosing feels confusing, but this is not a matter of intuition, there is a concrete reason. The reasoning should make the answer convincing. This decision matters in real games. Choose correctly and you may gain the advantage. Choose wrongly and the position may soon become impossible to control. Let us finish considering the choices. The goal is to learn a way of thinking. Should black take B, the key point affecting both sides, or concentrate on expanding and enclosing black's own territory? Use black's enclosure at C to understand the position. After C, white has no invasion point and must concede the entire right side. It looks large for black, so why is C still wrong? Judge the position objectively. Let us mark the area, and the reason will become clear. Why can black not fly here? This move encloses roughly a 6x6 square. That is a generous estimate. Pause and assess its real size. Suppose the move adds another 6x6 area, perhaps 30 or 40 points, though the real value is certainly lower. Now compare the two frameworks. If white takes B, black can no longer enter the upper side. Which area is larger? The position is clear. If the opponent's framework is larger than yours, why compete by enclosing territory? Black must fly toward the center and limit white's development. What if black cannot capture white after white comes in? Then find a way to attack. If black chooses mutual enclosure while already behind, black lacks enough points. Worrying about white's invasion does not solve that problem. The opponent's framework is larger. Black's strategy must be mutual reduction and disruption, not mutual enclosure. If black's framework were larger, then mutual enclosure would be correct. Many positions are this clear. For example, in this shape, black would certainly enclose this side because the central flying move no longer has value and black can build from here. Even if white's framework is still large, black's flying move cannot reduce it much. If white invades, black may fly once more later, but only this small outer area is reduced. Black cannot enter below either. Compare the two marked areas. Black's enclosure is larger. When frameworks appear, should you fight for the central key point that affects both sides? Do not memorize a fixed answer. Analyze the areas objectively and compare them. Here, the flying move has little meaning. If white flies over, black can attack on this side. White gains only a little, while black encloses more. What if black's enclosure still is not enough? That problem began earlier. This is a position where we do the best possible. Flying now would be even worse because white would destroy the right side. But without moves 1 and 2, white's framework is larger, and black cannot tolerate white crossing over. Since black is smaller, black must reduce white first. How to handle white's later invasion is a separate question. Mutual enclosure is unfavorable. At a critical moment, think carefully and do not memorize. Decide whether to take the key point affecting both sides or to enclose territory by comparing the position. Judge carefully whose framework is truly larger. In a similar position in another game, enclosing might be correct. Do not assume that the central key point is always mandatory. Here, objective comparison shows that white's framework is larger. Since mutual enclosure is unfavorable for black, black must fly toward the center. Later, black may drill in from here. With that possibility and the forcing moves on this side, black can push white back to an ordinary fourth line extension and erase the center. White can invade the right, but cannot make two eyes effortlessly. Black's attack will be severe. Black is prepared to invite white in. That is the real logic behind the expert's choice. Now let us continue to the next move. After black flies toward the center, where should white play a reduction? This tests the same reasoning: should white reduce, invade deeply at B, or avoid limiting black? Mutual enclosure is no longer possible. If white plays passively, black takes the center, so white must act. Let me explain why I picked so many positions like these. First, they are practical, all from recent top-level games and truly brilliant ones. Second, they keep you current. You can feel how modern Go is actually played, and I think that matters a great deal. I could teach older theory, but it is less useful now. Since AI arrived, many things have changed. I hope these lessons keep you up to date. Lock in your answer. Moving on. I can tell you I do not recommend the champion's choice. It is playable, but only as his personal show. Do not copy it. Far too risky. A bold, flashy move, but not one for us to learn. He played this, saying, "Even if you add another enclosing move, I can still get in." Supreme skill breeds daring. But honestly, do not imitate it. This is a personal style move. Once black expands here, getting in is still hard. Entry is hard, and even living there is a painful, unprofitable life. He trusts his own rescuing skill too much. So let us focus on A and B. Everyone's first instinct is B, of course, because it erases the opponent's territory to the maximum. But with B, be careful, we must analyze objectively. Do not fantasize, I will comfortably wreck his territory and then slip away. If it were that easy, your opponent would be too kind. What if he hit you right in the face, attacking hard to kill this lone stone deep inside? I am not saying B fails, I just want you to see the Slayer. He fights back, you panic, your play falls apart, the stone dies, a free gift. Look carefully, black has a wall up top. Those stones are not just sitting there for show. With that much strength, you dive in and press him down to the third line? If you were black, you would fight back too. Most players would. That is my point. Here we must weigh our own safety. It does not have to be exactly A, this spot may work too. In short, mind your own survival here. Something like this looks much more composed. If he encloses territory, we stay comfortable. You may say, teacher, he still built plenty. Well, so did you, up top. In some positions, you must stay objective. Someone says, invade and live. Wishes are not plans. Let us stay objective. So in this kind of position, I recommend reducing at these two spots. Fully respecting the thickness above. If that wall were lower or thinner, we could go deeper, but one way or another, this position calls for reduction. That is my message here. As for invading, it does not necessarily die, you can struggle in there, but go in with your eyes open, prepared for a hard rescue. One student suggests P5. It does not quite work. The latter is the problem. The opponent answers on this side because P5's follow-up relies on attaching underneath. A quick lesson then, after P5 the normal answer is below. If he goes this way, fine, you attach. But he can play underneath. And then the attachment fails. When the latter does not work, I do not recommend P5. Pause and check that you see why. If the latter fails, you end up with two weak groups, frankly asking for trouble in a zone full of enemy stones. You say, I want to practice rescuing, deliberately making two weak groups. Fine, that is your own show. Normally, before this cap, check the ladder, the opponent has a counterhane. Why reduce exactly here? Let me pause on that. If he plays here, we easily attach down. If he caps, we extend along the side. If he pincers, we run out. If he flies, we calmly press. Not as good as attaching directly, but you cannot ask for too much. Do not overreach. Conditions do not allow it. Close enough is good enough. We can settle, even if black pincers, we press and poke our head out, roughly the same result. He has the numbers here. Not everything can be ours. But if your ladder works, the cap is playable. Say you have a stone over here, then capping is quite good. It all depends on whether the attachment below works. Let's move on. A brilliant fight between both sides. White plays here, black encloses, and white breaks in. Quick sketch. Black encloses, white flies, and black feels awkward. If black attaches, a turn remains. White can even come across first, black must add a move. Poor efficiency. Black boldly pressed close, fleeing looked spineless, so white dove deeper. Black cut across, grave danger, no way out through the center. Let him struggle there. Against white's twisting maneuvers, black chose a line both sides could accept. Extending instead would mean a pure life and death gamble. White claiming, I can live. Why don't I recommend this? It is tightrope walking. Only supreme skill makes such daring possible. We cannot copy it. Frankly, it is over the line. Even whether white Ataris first is unclear, he might probe over here before living, but that is desperately hard. In the game black gave Atari, white poked his head out, and things settled down. Hemming white in here is difficult, so black risky. Connected and let white out. One push, and white was through. As you can see, no net works here, there is a sautéed, and the ladder fails too. Now, a tesuji to teach you. Can anyone find it? Pause the video and find this move. Take a full minute. Then I will reveal the answer either way. White has a tesuji here. Do not rush it. A gorgeous tesuji. I hope you spot it yourselves. I trust you. This class is strong. I know what you are capable of. If white connects at n8 first and only then clamps, white can die outright. This group lacked eyes, connect first and you risk losing everything. Right tesuji, wrong order, you must play s8 first. Those of you who found s8, bravo, you are superhuman. With s8 in place, black cannot break white's eye space. Black can only turn, then we connect, and those three stones cannot die either. Then one hey nay, done and dusted, black collapses, he could resign on the spot. So white must clamp first. I am not being picky, connecting first is truly dangerous. That extra stone hands black a panicky, and black cannot just charge in either. He must play the long game and besiege white later. Now white's diagonal, vicious. Answer this first, then I will explain. What should black play here? There is a lot to learn from this. Clearly, white is dancing on the cliff's edge. A word here, white is walking a tightrope. You can see this white group is in serious danger. Even now, it has no clear eyes. But dangerous or not, we will come back to that. This middle game idea is important. Study it together with the next diagram. There is a reason they are world champions and we are still training. World titles are not won by boasting. They are earned one game at a time. First, why not A? If A worked, your opponent would have to be hopeless. This group can run. Yet he chose not to run, staying inside, determined to take back capital and interest. Then, can you cut and kill? Not now, one Atari and he lives. This way you cannot kill the group. The tiger's mouth lives too. He can also fly on the edge. Capture there, he recaptures and lives. A gift. All vulgar moves, they turn white's burden into a living group. Black must never push this weak group toward life. There was a chance against it, but the direct kill fails. So why play up top? This move is wrong, releasing the tiger back to the mountain, and that one is slack, so neither diagram exists. Then why C and not B? Pay attention, this game has one great target, this white group. It cannot be killed yet, the direct cut falls short, the net fails. And you ask, isn't C just marching to its death? Exactly right. But then, come kill me, do you dare? How exactly will you kill me? So what if I cannot live in there? Tell me, don't you feel a chill down your back? We cannot kill you yet, but you are not alive. 2 more stones above, and we break in. Pause if you see it. This is vision. Do not stare only at the top. Black is likely dead in there, but do you dare take him? More stones in the center, and you are gone. Not the cut. We fly in from below or hit this point and you might be finished on the spot. This dragon. The feint, attack one thing, aim at another. The shoulder hit works, but this point is sharper, and he dare not fight back. Against the tiger's mouth we hane over, cutting first, he dare not block. In the game he connected, already profit for us. So probe from the top first, then land this move, hard for white to answer. This is a combat technique, test your opponent with moves like these. Even like this, you still dare not move freely. This is no longer a fight about the top alone. Looking only at the top, you have many answers, and black gains little. But you cannot spare a move. Your dragon has one exit. You rely on that being Sente, he cannot cut you off yet. But the road is narrow, one exit, no eyes below, one eye at most. If that path closes, one more blockade and you are gone. So he goes to stir things up on top. You see, when the straight line attack fails, we do not give up. Giving up is too slack. We circle around and apply maximum pressure. What makes a world champion? This. I am not boasting for them. They truly play brilliantly. Learn this way of thinking. Why not attack directly? If that worked, 54 was a blunder. It cannot kill. Pushing through fails too. Let me show you. After the push, white still lives. If black flies, white captures the middle. Let me show it. If black connects, white lives by making the eye. If black flies again, white attaches and cuts, still alive. Hit this point and white clamps. Then white captures. If black squeezes the middle, white kicks here. There is no life and death problem. Even after the thrust, white lives, so black must detour. So black goes roundabout, the direct kill fails. He heads up top. White's center is unsettled, no daring attacks, no enclosing the top. He jumps out. Two purposes. Test your firepower. If you die, it is over, and these stones support the center. Take that in. White is afraid too. Champions are not invincible. Once the top turns chaotic, his dragon could get rolled up and die. If it dies, black can throw away any number of stones up top. Lose that dragon, lose the game. So white jumps first, shutting black in. Whether the kill works is another matter. With these two stones, his dragon is safe. The center cannot be rolled up. Black slides down in turn. I will not narrate this part, just enjoy it. A running battle unfolds, commentary adds little, so let us skip ahead a few moves. A ferociously complex fight. Here is the branch point. Black played 85, and after that white is a little thin. You can see a way back home here. If white plugs the gap, this solid extension leads to a capturing race, most likely ko below. White is under real pressure, descending directly black's descent also is sente, and this white clump is heavy. So the ko is risky for white too. Close the door, and black has no way out except to fight for his life. Finally, as some of you guessed, this is Xiao versus Yifei, the Tianyuan Challenger Final, played just last week on the 13th. So here, white chose to compromise, and things settled down. Not playing here is extremely dangerous. Black comes through, and white gets scraped draw. Let me show you. Truly brutal. White can live, but perhaps only like this, with stones dropping off the top. So he decided to capture this. Then black's descent is absolute sente, white captures half, black's group lives. Black is Yifei, white is Xiao. Now, today's final exercise. Up top, both sides felt shaky, so they settled on a result both could accept. Black lives with half, white keeps the floor. The focus returns to the center and the bottom. Should black extend along the side, take the 3-3? Or keep attacking? Think it over. One move I advise against. Avoid that one, and you are doing fine. That obvious one. Which do you say it is, A, B, or C? If you picked it, no blame, most class did. One student says, taking the bottom lacks ambition. Surely we fly into the center, which proves you have not attended enough of my classes. When I talk like that, I am giving you direction. The only unplayable move is B. Flying into the center is actually fine, just a bit risky. I will explain shortly. Stay calm, why can't we play B? B is flat out wrong. You must come back here, pause and see why. Skip it and you die. This side is worth far more than the corner. Black might enclose 20 plus points here, white has already built 30 plus. No corner yields 30, normally barely over 20, so never take the 3-3 now, the side outweighs the corner. A strong player hains once and plays elsewhere. You say, I will grab 2 forcing moves, then press him so one move cannot fix it all. A real expert hains hard, you get no time. Ignore it, and he descends, a free corner gone. Hain he extends away, refusing to brawl. Patch up, he pushes, you lose, fight, he extends again, you lose more. Why not C now? C is a bit risky. Look closely, the balance of thickness has changed. This white move is essentially sente, you attack, he answers along, and the sustained attack likely ends in gote. It feels satisfying, but in the end we must come back and extend below. These attacks are paper tigers. They gain no territory, and you can easily trap yourself. You ask, what about before? Earlier, yes, there was a chance to kill white, but white chose those consecutive defensive moves in the center to support his dragon, so the killing chance is gone. That is partly why white kept deferring to black, letting him connect back home. This extension is sente. With it, the dragon is safe. Still, white stayed wary of all-out fights. If a ko for life broke out up top, the right side dragon would be lost. So black skips the attacking fly. It risks spoiling aji or ending in gote. Never B, we normally play A, then come back around. If white does not wreck black's territory, that is tempo. The kill is gone, so we call off the troops. Black stormed after white while the kill was possible. Now white's extension is absolute sente, chance gone. Nor will black play the reverse sente tiger's mouth. Remain. White enjoy the full game later. One more technique along the way. Ding Yifei, black, returned to the bottom. In the game, Lian Xiao's next 2 moves were slow. Once black sealed the top, black was ahead. What white needed, before black sealed the boundary, was to probe the corner first. This is the AI's view, not my brilliance. With that probe, the game stays close. White probes first, then hains. Black can hardly kill outright. One block and a ko for life may remain. Then, white returns to the center tiger's mouth, plays on as in the game. A close contest. Forcing the kill is extremely hard. You see white has a hane here, then the block. With the boundary not yet sealed, black cannot force the kill in this corner. Even if black plays the tiger's mouth the moment white attaches, it is the same. White should have probed first, then black can hardly kill him. The kick does not hold. One Hani and white has resources. This is hindsight. Missing it over the board is normal. After that, the area went soft. White's chance was gone. From there, the game tilted to black. Once 101 sealed it, nothing was left inside. White took normal endgame. Black probes with a placement. White cannot connect. With the push, white can no longer enclose this side. But pushing through, the center comes under black's flying attack, and faintly, a connect and die lurks here. So white hung on grimly, guarding that connect and die. He dared not add stones below. One more black stone there, and the talk collapses. So white could only play here. Black pokes out from this side, and white is already short. Connecting looks normal, but it falls short. Black kicks, and the game is not enough, or black jumps, then kicks back, and white's territory no longer adds up. In the game, white gambled here, covering this side, since the jump is sente with that connect and die above. But the bottom got cut. Being behind, wanting the attachment now, too late, black's line is too thick. True, with even slightly thinner walls, there might still be something. So that placement came too late. The push falls short. Descending and stirring up trouble was all that remained. This game was Dong Yifei at his best. After the push, white had no road. This is not enough, so only the wedge, feeding black stones to white for liberty. And then, a dazzling pivot, a dazzling tesuji, one move, and the game is decided. See it? Beautiful, isn't it? Advancing to the final with moves like this, taking the match. This stone has slipped past, and white's whole potential on the left is gone. Trying the corner now comes too late. Quenches no thirst. Here, they are dry stones. Short on time, so briefly, there is a hane here. Before black seals the boundary, forcing the kill is hard. Quick look, capturing directly fails. Ko. This Atari fails too. He makes the tiger's mouth, and again a shameless ko. And if ko breaks out here, white risks nothing at all. It is all black's territory, so black wastes a move even by winning. But black can descend firmly on this side. Then there is nothing. The position is too thick, and capturing 3 stones achieves nothing. That is why, earlier, black could not play this way before the boundary was sealed, and why, once it was sealed, white was lost. Take a careful look, and pause here if you see it clearly. At this point, it truly does nothing. Crossing under is fine too. So after that missed chance, Dong Yifei went on to defeat Lian Xiao and claim the Tianyuan Challenger's seat. From this game, remember these key points. The small knight corner defense, the side extension on the left, and the flying cap in the center, plus where black reduced after the cap. Learn them and use them in your own games. That is all for today. Class dismissed. See you next time.